Joining me now in studio, Harvey Kaye. He's professor of democracy and justice studies, so I already love that, at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and he's the author of the book, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. Harvey, welcome.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you in studio. So Harvey, talk to us about what you mean by radical again.
Yeah, that's interesting because we're in the middle of a crisis, and I don't just mean a crisis of Donald Trump. We're in the middle of a crisis that's been in the making for 40 to 45 years. I mean, look at the inequality that's emerged. Look at the degree to which we've seen workers' rights under siege, women's rights under siege, and of course, the right to vote by people of color, and even young and old people. Their rights, we've seen rights under siege. So we're in a crisis of democracy. And it strikes me that we're in a crisis comparable, I'm serious about this, 1770s, the 1860s, the 1930s and 40s, and it's our time to do what Americans did then. And we often forget this. We forget the fact that 1776 was about the makings of a democratic republic. The 1860s was about sustaining the Union, but in order to create an independent America, we actually did make the America of that day freer, more equal, and more democratic. In order to sustain the Union in the 1860s, and Lincoln came to recognize this, the only way to sustain the Union was actually to reach into American history and make real, as best he could, the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. And he was empowered, as were the founders, by the fact that it was a bottom-up kind of energy. It was a struggle from below. And if you think about the 1930s, the worst economic and social catastrophe in American history, the Franklin Roosevelt administration was all about empowering working people. And there again, working people themselves pushed FDR possibly further than he might otherwise have gone. So my view is if we're in a crisis today, then our task becomes making America radical again, making real the promise of the 1770s, making real the promise of the New Deal, making real the kinds of things that America should be about. And too often we've forgotten these things. They've been, if you like, our memories have been distracted and suppressed by powers seemingly beyond our control.
So every once in a while, right-wing blogs and websites get a hold of something I say and they make a big deal out of it. I'm almost always amused by it. So I once said that the Holocaust was done by Christians, and they're like, "How dare you?" But was it Buddhist? I don't even understand the critique, right? And then, and about the founding fathers, I said, they were incredibly progressive. And they're like, ridiculous. They were all conservative. All right, Harvey, you're a historian. What were they?
The founding generation was a revolutionary generation. I mean, let's not forget, the rebellion of 1774 and 1775 might well have never become a revolution. And then my hero, ever since I was a kid, Thomas Paine, authors Common Sense. And what he says, and he's not inventing this, he's responding to what he sees in America itself. He says, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And when and moreover, and this is to make a sidebar, but a very significant sidebar, in Common Sense, he calls for separation of church and state. And it's fundamental because it enables those who are of minority faiths, Presbyterians, Baptists, Congregationalists, well, they weren't a minority in New England, but you have these folks, Catholics and Jews, who see the revolution as not simply a matter of independence, but a matter of really securing freedom. Not only freedom in a political sense, but freedom in a religious sense. In fact, Paine himself once said, if the war had been fought only for independence, it would not have been worth fighting. It was because we wanted a democratic republic characterized by separation of church and state. We want to show the world that we don't have to be ruled by kings, aristocrats, or people with a hell of a lot of property.
Right, or religious oligarchs.
Or indeed, religious oligarchs, right, yeah. Priests and bishops.
Because, and the other thing that leads to is constant war. The Catholics win, they kill all the Protestants. The Protestants win, they kill all the Catholics.
Or they all go after the Jews.
Or they all kill all the Jews, exactly right. And so we headed that off at the pass. Now the founding fathers were nowhere near perfect, and
absolutely not.
That's so obvious that we don't even have to get into it here. But they were far more progressive than their counterparts at the time. So now they criticize Bernie Sanders for talking about revolution. How do you think this country got started? Right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. In every generation, if you look at American history closely, from the bottom up, from a more critical perspective. You see whether they were abolitionists, religious free thinkers, women's rights advocates, populists, progressives, labor unionists, socialists, we can come all the way down the line. They always look back to the revolution. And there they discovered not only the promise of the Declaration, they actually embraced Thomas Paine as their hero, their champion. And in many ways, it's our job to redeem that kind of promise, that vision. And I want to go further. I think Americans yearn to do that. And I think all too often, the establishments of both parties, okay, the Republicans try to suppress memory. The problem with the Democrats for too many years is that they turn their back on American history. And it's our generation's opportunity to make America, as Langston Hughes would have said it, really America.
Yeah, and so that's why we have the American flag in the background, guys. Because the idea of America is a fantastic idea. Have we always lived up to it? No, right? But that doesn't mean we can't. The correct path in my mind is not to rip down the idea of America, but to actually live up to it, to build it up and to build ourselves up so that we could be worthy of that idea.
Well said. Well, I should have had you endorse my book. Very well said.
Okay, thank you. So I actually got now a t-shirt idea for you. Because you might be one of the rare guys who's a bigger fan of Thomas Paine than me and my dad, who love him, right? No pain, no gain.
I love it, right? But next TYT
Shop
shirt.
Yeah, that's right, shoptyt.com.
I actually was going to buy a TYT sweatshirt to wear tonight, and somebody said, don't you think it's a little patronizing? But I think no pain, no gain is great.
Yeah, no, we'll get you I was gonna say t-shirt, that sounded cheap for a second. Sweatshirt, we'll get you the sweatshirt.
That'd be great.
Okay, so no, but let's keep going, right? So in throughout history, as you're pointing out here, every time we now look back at it and celebrate those folks. Yeah. Oh, the abolitionists, they helped to get rid of slavery. Now they're heroes, and and Harriet Tubman, an incredible hero. Dr. King, the civil rights
Douglas,
hero.
I mean, we can go on and on, right?
Right. And every one of those was a progressive. Every single one.
Right. The story of America is actually the story of progressivism and radicalism. And one way to look at it, sometimes tell my students, think about these dates. And I lay out a whole series of dates, and then of course they go scrambling. You can cheat, look at each other's paper, I don't mind. The point is that there are those moments in American history. We didn't win them all, but there are those moments in American history when we remember who we are and we begin to try to live up to that memory. And I look, we're at that moment right now. I mean, I think about 2016, and I was waiting for Bernie specifically to speak of the American past. And he did it on one occasion, okay? It was a beautiful evening, a beautiful event at Georgetown in November 2015, actually. Mm-hmm. But he's really amazed me, and I've really been excited this time because they've really laid hold of the FDR tradition now. The New Deal, the Green New Deal. Economic Bill of Rights, a 21st century economic Bill of Rights. I mean, we're at a critical moment. We're in a crisis, but even in the midst of the crisis, there are so many currents of progressive possibilities. The trick is, can we bring them together? Can we create some kind of united front for enhancing and extending and deepening democracy? So the challenge is in front of us.
And so when you ask anyone to name an American hero that's conservative, they'll either give a preposterously wrong answer, right? Like, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, yeah, he was conservative. They're like ridiculous, right?
Right.
Or they're like, Reagan, hero to the rich.
Right. Look, conservatives do a really great job of trying to lay claim to our heroes.
Right.
I mean, Ronald Reagan shocked all conservatives, no one more than George Will on the night that he accepted the Republican nomination for president in 1980, when he quoted, imagine this, in the course of his acceptance speech, he quoted Thomas Paine, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And George Will's head must have been spinning like in The Exorcist, that's all I can tell you. Because seriously speaking, he knew that most Americans had a kind of progressive memory, and he was gonna lay hold of that, in part because he once upon a time had been an FDR and Truman Democrat. So he knew the degree to which Americans would respond to names like Paine and Lincoln and FDR. And look, the job of people on the left, progressives, liberals, democratic socialists, radicals, our job is basically to enable and enhance American memory. even as we're pursuing a political agenda. And to bring those together to, not just to make people angry about what we've lost or what we've done to ourselves over years, but all the more to know what we're capable of doing.
Unfortunately, on the show, we keep coming back to this. And I feel that people might think that we're doing it because we're part of the media and we're challenging the old media. I swear to God, it's not because of that. We keep coming back to the same thing. Like, when you just think about it for 1 second, it becomes abundantly clear that all the American heroes are progressives and overthrew an established system and expanded the circle of liberty and brought further justice, the suffragettes, and the list goes on, right?
Yeah.
No one could claim the suffragettes and the civil rights movement weren't progressive.
Right.
Well, no one could claim FDR that this Social Security wasn't progressive. Right. So now, but the media never acknowledges that this country is progressive and built on a foundation of progressives.
Well, the media generally, we realize, is not only literally willing to push aside progressive voices, they're also willing to suppress the progressive story, okay? And when they're willing to talk about it, they always get it wrong, or they portray folks as somehow radical on the right and on the left. There's a term we've lost touch with from when I was growing up before you were born. The word reactionary, all right? Progressives and radicals were on the left and reactionaries were on the right. And I use so look, a radical to me, a progressive, these are like this, okay? And our task is to recover the radicalism that is the American story and enhance democracy progressively. I mean, it comes to that. So, I mean, I could sit here and tell you how much I enjoy TYT. I love the fact that that American flag is there. And I think, and I would even pitch you, let's do more history on TYT, something like that. I'm ready to help. I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think, look, I mean, this is a great venue, okay? I don't know if you realize being out here in California, how many people back there across the country are actually tuning in. Well, you know the numbers, but it's also the case that people actually respond on Twitter when I say I'm gonna be on. They say, oh, wow, that's so exciting. And I say, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, we appreciate that. So back to FDR for a second.
Happily.
So, yes, another one of your heroes, another one of all of our heroes. And so, talk to me about what he did at the time and how analogous it might be to today.
Okay, well, the first thing is, and this goes to true of Paine and Lincoln and maybe especially FDR, had incredible confidence in their fellow citizens. You wouldn't have heard FDR saying, well, I'm unelectable.
Yeah.
Okay, what he did is when he ran in the spring of 1932, he laid out week by week and month by month an agenda, always linking that agenda to the American story. So for example, in 1932, he actually called up in San Francisco at the Commonwealth Club for an economic declaration of rights. Long before people, I mean, most people don't even remember that part of it. They say, well, late in his presidency, he called for an economic bill of rights. No, in 1932, he called for an economic declaration of rights to, if you like, renew the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, the social contract. Then in 1941, January 41, before we had begun in the war, he lays out the vision of the four freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And this, even though Americans couldn't recite them, Americans don't take quizzes well, it really became the spirit of the war effort. Now, undeniably, Roosevelt made some tragic mistakes: the internment of the Japanese Americans, the failure to integrate the military, the inability to get Congress to open the doors to more Jewish refugees from Europe. But the fact is that if you look from 32 through the war years, it's always an effort to push progressive politics. I mean, he really was a social democrat. The term he didn't use, he used the word liberal, but it was social democracy. Pretty much what we're talking about with Bernie Sanders, social democracy. And then in 1944, he never gave up the idea of the Economic Declaration of Rights or the vision of the four freedoms. In January of 44, in the State of the Union, he called for an economic bill of rights. And even warned, and I love this, in the speech, he warned that there will be those who will seek to prevent this from ever taking place. He points a finger at big corporations and political reactionaries. And what he says is we should not be fooled.
Yep, and if someone proposed freedom from want today, that's bolder, arguably, than even what Sanders or any of the other candidates are proposing,
Right.
and they'd be called socialist and maybe even communist. What do you mean freedom from want?
Right.
Like they would be absolutely outraged.
Right.
And then you ask them, what do you think about FDR? Oh, FDR's an American hero. You know he was actually conservative.
You know, I'll add one thing. 1943, Roosevelt started asking himself, what will Americans want after the war? And he asked the National Opinion Research Council, which was at Princeton at the time, to run surveys. And just to give you an example, 85% of Americans, these were both Republicans and Democrats, wanted national health care. What we would today call Medicare for all. Can you imagine 85%? And I'll let people know that at no point since then have we necessarily seen the 85% number. However, at no point have fewer than 50% of Americans wanted national health care.
That's right. Unfortunately, all the corporate power is in the other smaller percentage.
Yeah.
But we're gonna win on that soon too. Everybody check out the book, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. Professor Harvey Kaye, wonderful historian. Thank you so much for joining us. Really
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
It's great to have met you finally.
Thank you. 2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below. Then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.